Picture this. You're sitting in a kingdom hall, listening intently as an elder explains that only 144,000 people will ever go to heaven. You look around the room at the hundreds of faces, multiply that by the millions of Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide, and a simple mathematical question begins to gnaw at your mind. If there are over 8 million witnesses today, and the religion has existed for more than a century, how can only 144,000 seats in heaven possibly accommodate everyone who has ever been faithful? The answer, you're told, is simple. Most witnesses aren't going to heaven at all. They're destined for a paradise on earth instead. But as you dig deeper into the history of this teaching, you discover something far more troubling than a simple doctrinal distinction. You uncover a pattern of manipulation, revision, and theological gymnastics that spans more than 100 years, a doctrine that has been adjusted, reinterpreted, and reinvented whenever the numbers stopped making sense or the prophecy began to crumble under its own weight. For generations, Jehovah's Witnesses have been taught that the 144,000 mentioned in the book of Revelation represents a literal number of anointed Christians who will rule with Christ in heaven. This teaching has been fundamental to the organization's theology, creating a two-tier system of believers: the elite, anointed class destined for heavenly glory, and the other sheep, or great crowd, who will live forever on a restored earthly paradise. It's a doctrine that has shaped the identity, hierarchy, and power structure of the Watchtower organization since its earliest days. But behind this seemingly straightforward biblical interpretation lies one of the most convoluted and constantly evolving doctrines in the history of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The story of the 144,000 is not just a tale of biblical exegesis gone wrong. It's a case study in how religious authority maintains control through selective interpretation, convenient revision, and the strategic manipulation of Scripture to serve organizational needs rather than theological truth. The mystery deepens when you examine the official reports published annually by the Watchtower Society. Year after year, these reports list the number of people who partake of the emblems at the memorial service, those who claim to be part of the anointed 144,000. Logic would dictate that as time marches forward and members of this exclusive group pass away, the number should steadily decline toward zero. After all, if the selection of the 144,000 was completed in 1935, as the organization taught for decades, then by now, in the 21st century, there should be very few, if any, of these anointed ones remaining. Yet the opposite has occurred. Instead of declining, the number of those claiming to be anointed has been rising. In 2005, the official count was 8,524. By 2015, it had grown to 15,177. By 2020, it reached 21,182. How does a finite number that supposedly closed its doors nearly 90 years ago continue to increase? The Watchtower Society has offered various explanations over the years, each more convoluted than the last, but none that truly resolve the fundamental contradiction at the heart of this doctrine. The origin of the doctrine. To understand how this theological puzzle came to be, we must journey back to the late 19th century, to a time when a young haberdashery businessman named Charles Taze Russell began to question the mainstream Christian doctrines of his day. Russell was born in 1852 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, into a Presbyterian family, but he grew disillusioned with traditional Christianity, particularly with doctrines like the Trinity and eternal hellfire. In 1870, at just 18 years old, Russell began leading a Bible study group, and by 1879, he had started publishing a magazine called Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. This publication would become the foundation of what would eventually evolve into the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the legal entity behind Jehovah's Witnesses. Russell was captivated by biblical prophecy, particularly the apocalyptic visions found in the books of Daniel and Revelation. He believed he was living in the last days and that Christ's invisible presence had begun in 1874, with the end of the Gentile times predicted for 1914. Among his many prophetic interpretations, Russell developed a particular fascination with the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation chapters 7 and 14. In the 7th chapter of Revelation, the Apostle John describes seeing 144,000 people sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe. In chapter 14, John sees the 144,000 standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion, described as those who had been purchased from the earth, who had not defiled themselves with women, interpreted as remaining spiritually pure, who follow the Lamb wherever he goes, and in whose mouths no lie was found. Russell interpreted these passages literally. He believed that exactly 144,000 Christians would be selected to reign with Christ in heaven. However, His understanding of who would constitute this group was somewhat different from what the Watchtower Society would later teach. Russell believed that this heavenly class had been selected throughout Christian history, starting with the apostles and continuing through the centuries with faithful Christians from various denominations. He initially taught that this selection process would be completed by 1881, and later revised this date to 1914. Importantly, Russell also believed that the great multitude, or great crowd, mentioned in Revelation 7 verse 9 was another heavenly class, a sort of secondary tier of Christians who would also go to heaven but would not be among the 144,000 ruling with Christ. In Russell's theology, there was no earthly class at all. All faithful Christians had a heavenly hope, though some would have greater positions of authority than others. This created an interesting dynamic in the early Bible student movement, as Russell's followers were then called. Everyone in the organization could partake of the bread and wine at the memorial of Christ's death, symbolizing their participation in the new covenant and their heavenly calling. There was no division between those going to heaven and those staying on earth, because Russell taught that faithful humanity would eventually be resurrected to heavenly life. The earth, once restored, would be inhabited by those who had not accepted Christ during their lifetime but would receive a second chance during the millennial reign. But this unified vision of the Christian hope would not survive Russell's death. The seeds of division, hierarchy, and manipulation were about to be planted by his successor. When Charles Taze Russell died in October 1916, the Bible student movement found itself at a crossroads. Russell had been the charismatic leader, the prophetic voice, the central figure around whom the entire organization revolved. His successor would need to establish his own authority and reshape the movement to secure his position. That successor was Joseph Franklin Rutherford, a lawyer from Missouri who had joined the Bible students in 1906 and had served as the organization's legal counsel. Rutherford was elected president of the Watchtower Society in January 1917, but his leadership was immediately challenged by several members of the board of directors who disagreed with his autocratic style and his departure from some of Russell's teachings. Rutherford responded to these challenges with an iron fist. He purged the dissidents from the organization, consolidated power in the office of the president, and began to systematically revise the doctrines that Russell had established. Where Russell had been a prophetic teacher who saw himself as facilitating Bible study, Rutherford positioned himself as a divine authority through whom God's revelations flowed. He renamed the organization Jehovah's Witnesses in 1931, distancing the movement from its Bible student origins and creating a distinct religious identity. But perhaps his most significant theological innovation was his reinterpretation of the 144,000 the great crowd, a change that would fundamentally alter the power structure of the organization and create the two-tier system that persists to this day. In 1935, at a convention in Washington, D.C., Rutherford introduced a revolutionary new teaching. He declared that the great multitude, or great crowd, mentioned in Revelation 7 verse 9 was not a secondary heavenly class, as Russell had taught, but rather an earthly class. These individuals would not go to heaven but would survive Armageddon and live forever in a restored paradise on earth. This interpretation was based on the phrase in Revelation 7 verse 9 that describes the great crowd as standing before the throne, which Rutherford now claimed meant in sight of the throne, rather than in the immediate presence of the throne in heaven. With this single doctrinal adjustment, Rutherford accomplished several strategic objectives simultaneously. First, he created a theological justification for the exponential growth of the organization. If only 144,000 people were going to heaven, and if most of these positions had already been filled during the first century of Christianity and throughout church history, then the vast majority of new converts would naturally belong to the earthly class. This meant that the organization could grow indefinitely without running into the mathematical impossibility of having more heavenly candidates than heavenly positions. Second, Rutherford established a clear spiritual hierarchy within the organization. The 144,000 became the anointed class, or the faithful and discreet slave, who would receive special spiritual insight and who would be responsible for feeding spiritual food to the rest of the flock. The earthly class, later called the other sheep, or great crowd, would be under the spiritual authority of the anointed. This created a structure of divine legitimacy for the leadership of the Watchtower Society, all of whom claimed to be among the anointed. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Rutherford's new doctrine provided a mechanism for controlling who could claim spiritual authority within the organization. Under Russell's teaching, any Bible student could claim to be among the 144,000, and this claim carried no special organizational authority. But under Rutherford's system, claiming to be anointed meant claiming to have special spiritual insight and a unique relationship with God. It also meant partaking of the emblems at the memorial, a public declaration of one's anointed status. Rutherford could now scrutinize and potentially challenge anyone who claimed such a position, asking them to prove their calling and subjecting them to organizational oversight. Most importantly, he established that the selection of the 144,000 was nearly complete. By declaring in 1935 that the gathering of the anointed class had essentially ended, Rutherford ensured that the vast majority of future witnesses would automatically be relegated to the earthly class, with no hope of achieving the same spiritual status as the leadership. This was not merely a theological interpretation. It was a brilliant exercise in organizational control that would have repercussions for decades to come. The announcement of this new teaching at the 1935 convention was met with tremendous enthusiasm. Thousands of Bible students who had been uncertain about their heavenly calling could now embrace an earthly hope with confidence and joy. The organization had given them a clear identity and a definite future. But buried within this joy was a troubling implication that would take years to fully manifest. If the selection of the 144,000 had closed in 1935, then the clock was ticking. The anointed ones would age, die, and decrease in number until none remained, at which point Armageddon would presumably arrive. This created an eschatological timeline that seemed reasonable in 1935 but would become increasingly problematic as the decades passed and the promised end failed to materialize. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Watchtower organization was experiencing explosive growth. The post-World War II era brought countless new converts into the fold, and congregations were multiplying across the globe. The door-to-door ministry that witnesses became famous for was bearing fruit, and the organization was becoming a significant religious movement worldwide. However, this growth brought with it an unexpected problem. The number of people claiming to be among the anointed was not declining as predicted. In fact, in some years, it was remaining stable or even increasing slightly. This should have been impossible according to the organization's own theology. If the selection of the 144,000 had been completed in 1935, then by the 1960s and 1970s, the remaining anointed ones should have been elderly individuals in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. With each passing year, death should have been thinning their ranks, and the number should have been dropping steadily toward zero. Instead, the memorial report showed that thousands of people were still partaking of the emblems annually, and the number was not declining at the rate one would expect if the class had been sealed 30 or 40 years earlier. Even more puzzling, younger individuals were beginning to claim that they had been called to the anointed class, people who were not even born when the selection supposedly closed in 1935. The organization initially dismissed these anomalies with ad hoc explanations. They suggested that some of the original anointed ones had proven unfaithful and had lost their position, necessitating replacements. This idea of replacement anointed ones provided a convenient explanation for why younger people might claim to be part of the 144,000. If an anointed person fell away from the faith or was disfellowshipped, another person could be called to fill their place. However, this explanation created its own set of problems. If replacements were being made, how could anyone be certain that the number was actually 144,000 at any given time? More troublingly, if anointed ones could lose their position through unfaithfulness, didn't that suggest a disturbing level of failure among those supposedly selected by God for the highest spiritual privilege? The organization also suggested that some individuals who claimed to be anointed were mistaken or mentally unbalanced. This subtle suggestion created a culture of suspicion around anyone, particularly younger individuals, who claimed to have received the heavenly calling. Elders were encouraged to counsel those who began partaking at the memorial, gently questioning whether they were truly anointed or whether they were perhaps confused, emotionally unstable, or seeking attention. This effectively discouraged many from publicly claiming their anointed status, as doing so would subject them to scrutiny, skepticism, and potentially stigmatization within their congregation. Yet despite these social pressures, the number of partakers continued to remain stubbornly high. By the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation of leadership had taken control of the organization, and none of them had been alive in 1935 when the calling supposedly closed. This created a legitimacy problem for the governing body, the small group of men who claimed to be the collective, faithful and discreet slave, through whom God was directing the organization. If the anointed class had been sealed in 1935, how could men born after that date claim to be part of it? The organization quietly began to soften its stance on the 1935 date, suggesting that perhaps the door to the anointed class had not slammed shut as definitively as previously taught. Maybe, they suggested, The calling had been substantially completed by 1935, but Jehovah had reserved the right to make additional selections as needed. This gradual backpedaling became official in 2007 when the Watchtower Society published an article explicitly stating that they could not find clear biblical evidence that the selection of the 144,000 had been completed by 1935. This was a stunning reversal, effectively abandoning a doctrine that had been taught for over 70 years. The article stated that the calling of anointed ones could continue right up until the end of the system of things, removing any temporal restriction on when someone could claim to be part of the 144,000. While this doctrinal adjustment solved the problem of explaining younger anointed ones, it created new theological dilemmas. If the calling was ongoing, how could the organization maintain that the end was imminent? If God was still selecting members of the anointed class, didn't that suggest that the organization's timeline for the end was wrong, and that perhaps many more years needed to pass before all 144,000 positions were filled? Furthermore, the abandonment of the 1935 date removed one of the key markers that had given urgency to the organization's message. For decades, witnesses had been taught that the generation of 1914, those who were alive when Christ's invisible presence began, would not pass away before Armageddon arrived. This teaching, combined with the closure of the anointed class in 1935, created a sense that the end was just around the corner. But as that generation died off and the 1935 date was abandoned, the organization was forced to revise its generation teaching multiple times, each time extending the timeline and diluting the sense of urgency that had motivated millions of witnesses in their ministry work. The mystery of the 144,000 was revealing itself to be not a divine puzzle waiting to be understood, but a human doctrine perpetually failing to align with reality. As the 21st century dawned, the Watchtower organization found itself in an increasingly untenable position regarding the 144,000 doctrine. The official count of memorial partakers, rather than declining towards zero as logic would demand, was rising dramatically. This created a crisis that required explanation, and the organization responded with a series of doctrinal adjustments that became increasingly convoluted and difficult for the average witness to follow. The history of these adjustments reveals a pattern. Whenever the facts contradicted the doctrine was revised to accommodate the facts, all while maintaining that the organization's understanding was progressively getting clearer and that God was gradually revealing truth to his people. One of the most significant adjustments came in 2013 when the organization redefined who constitutes the faithful and discreet slave, mentioned in Matthew 24 verses 45 to 47. For decades, the Watchtower had taught that all 144,000 anointed ones collectively made up the faithful and discreet slave. However, in 2013, they announced that only the governing body, the small group of men leading the organization from world headquarters, were actually the faithful and discreet slave. The other anointed ones scattered throughout the world were simply members of the anointed class but had no special role in providing spiritual food or directing the organization. This change was remarkable for several reasons. First, it concentrated authority and divine legitimacy even more narrowly, removing any potential challenge to the governing body's decisions from other anointed ones who might claim equal spiritual insight. Second, it tacitly admitted that the vast majority of those claiming to be anointed had no special spiritual function at all, raising the question of why God would select them for the 144,000 if they served no purpose during their earthly life. Third, it created a three-tier hierarchy, the governing body at the top as God's sole channel of communication, the remaining anointed ones in the middle with no special authority but with a heavenly hope, and the great crowd at the bottom with an earthly hope and no direct role in organizational leadership. The organization also began to address the increasing number of partakers more directly in their publications. They suggested that many of those claiming to be anointed were likely mistaken, suffering from mental or emotional instability, or being influenced by pride and presumption. A 2016 Watchtower article stated that the increase in partakers did not necessarily mean that more people were actually being chosen by God for the anointed class. Instead, it suggested that some were partaking unworthily, misunderstanding their calling, or even being influenced by the devil to create confusion. This was a remarkable admission, essentially telling the faithful that they should not trust the memorial reports as an accurate count of the true anointed ones, and that the visible numbers were unreliable indicators of spiritual reality. This created a peculiar situation where the organization was simultaneously maintaining that there were exactly 144,000 positions in heaven, while admitting that they had no way of knowing how many people currently holding those positions were actually legitimate. If many of the current partakers were mistaken or false, as the organization suggested, then the true number of anointed ones might be much smaller than the published figures indicated. But this raised another question. If the organization, led by Spirit-anointed men who claimed to be God's channel of communication, could not accurately identify who was truly anointed and who was not, what did that say about their spiritual discernment? How could they claim to be sole arbiters of biblical truth if they could not distinguish between genuine and false anointed ones within their own ranks? The theological gymnastics became even more elaborate when addressing the heavenly resurrection. The organization taught that anointed ones who died would be resurrected to heaven immediately upon death, or more precisely, at some point after 1918 when Christ supposedly began inspecting his spiritual temple. This meant that potentially thousands of the 144,000 were already in heaven, reigning with Christ. However, Revelation 20 verses 4-6 describes the first resurrection occurring after Christ's 1,000-year reign begins, which witnesses believe has not yet started. To reconcile this, the organization taught that anointed ones who died were in a state of unconsciousness until 1918, at which point those who had died faithfully were resurrected to heaven, and any anointed ones dying after 1918 were resurrected immediately upon death. But this created yet another problem. If thousands of anointed ones have been in heaven since 1918, ruling with Christ for over 100 years, what exactly have they been doing? The organization's answer was vague, suggesting they were engaged in spiritual warfare and helping to direct events on earth, but providing no biblical support for this claim. Each doctrinal adjustment, while solving one problem, created new contradictions and raised new questions. The organization found itself in a position where maintaining the literal interpretation of the 144,000 required an increasingly complex web of explanations, exceptions, and revisions. The doctrine that was supposed to be a clear biblical truth had become one of the most confusing and controversial aspects of witness theology, even for faithful members who tried earnestly to understand and accept the organization's teachings. To understand the full scope of the manipulations surrounding the 144,000 doctrine, we must examine what the Bible actually says about this number and how biblical scholars, both inside and outside the witness tradition, have interpreted these passages. The two key references to the 144,000 appear in Revelation chapters 7 and 14, both highly symbolic and apocalyptic portions of Scripture that use vivid imagery, metaphorical language, and numerological symbolism throughout. The question that must be asked is this: why does the Watchtower Society insist on interpreting the number 144,000 literally when virtually every other number and image in Revelation is understood symbolically? In Revelation chapter 7, John describes seeing 4 angels holding back the 4 winds of the earth, and another angel ascending from the east with the seal of the living God. This angel calls out to the 4 angels, telling them not to harm the earth until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. John then hears the number of those sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel, with 12,000 sealed from each of the 12 tribes. The passage then lists the 12 tribes by name, though interestingly, this list differs from the traditional listing of Israel's tribes found elsewhere in the Old Testament. After this, John sees a great crowd, which no man was able to number, out of all nations and tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. The Watchtower Society interprets the 144,000 as literal but the 12 tribes of Israel as symbolic, representing spiritual Israel rather than literal Jewish tribes. This selective literalism is problematic from a hermeneutical standpoint. If the tribes are symbolic, why is the number literal? The passage explicitly states that the 144,000 come from the 12 tribes of Israel, with 12,000 from each tribe. If we understand this symbolically, as representing the complete number of God's faithful people, both Jewish and Gentile, then the number itself becomes symbolic of completeness and perfection rather than a literal head count. Throughout Revelation, numbers carry symbolic significance. The number 7, which appears repeatedly, represents completeness or perfection. The number 12 is associated with God's organized people, based on the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. The number 3.5, or 42 months, or 1,260 days, appears multiple times and is understood symbolically to represent a period of persecution or testing. The number 666 is universally understood as symbolic rather than literal. Given this consistent pattern of symbolic numerology throughout Revelation, interpreting 144,000 as a literal count seems inconsistent with the genre and style of apocalyptic literature. Moreover, the number 144,000 is mathematically significant. It is 12 times 12 times 1,000. In biblical numerology, 12 represents God's organized people or governmental perfection. Squaring 12 times 12 equals 144, intensifies this meaning, suggesting perfect organization. Multiplying by 1,000, a number suggesting completeness or an indefinitely large quantity, creates 144,000, a number that symbolically represents the complete, perfect, and total number of God's people, however many that might actually be. This interpretation aligns with how other numbers are understood throughout Revelation and eliminates the need for the complex explanations required by a literal interpretation. Furthermore, the description of the 144,000 in Revelation 14 verses 3 to 4 presents problems for a literal interpretation. They are described as virgins, who did not defile themselves with women. If we interpret this literally, it would mean that only celibate men could be part of the 144,000, excluding all women and all married men. The Watchtower Society recognizes that this must be interpreted symbolically, as representing spiritual purity and faithfulness to God rather than literal virginity. But if this characteristic is symbolic, why insist the number itself is literal? The passage also says these are the ones who were bought from the earth, and they were bought from among mankind as firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. The term firstfruits in biblical usage refers to the first portion of the harvest, which implies that a larger harvest follows. This suggests that the 144,000, if understood as a distinct group at all, would be the initial or representative portion of a much larger saved multitude. The relationship between the 144,000 and the great crowd in Revelation 7 provides another clue to the symbolic interpretation. The Watchtower Society teaches that these are two distinct groups, one heavenly and one earthly. However, the text presents them in parallel, with the 144,000 described as being sealed for protection and the great crowd described as having come out of the Great Tribulation and standing before God's throne. Both groups are portrayed positively, both serve God, and both are associated with salvation. The most natural reading is that these are two different perspectives on the same group. The 144,000 representing God's people viewed from the perspective of completeness and organization, and the great crowd representing the same people viewed from the perspective of their vast number and diverse origin. Biblical scholars outside the Jehovah's Witness tradition overwhelmingly interpret the 144,000 symbolically. Commentaries from various theological perspectives, whether Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, or academic, generally agree that the number represents the totality of God's redeemed people, the faithful from both Jewish and Gentile backgrounds, the complete church of all ages. The literal interpretation is virtually unique to the Watchtower Society and a few other small religious groups. This is not to say that majority opinion automatically determines truth, but it does raise the question of why the Watchtower's interpretation differs so dramatically from how Christians throughout history have understood these passages, and whether organizational needs rather than biblical exegesis have driven their interpretation. Beyond the theological problems with the 144,000 doctrine lies a deeper and perhaps more troubling issue: the profound psychological impact this teaching has had on millions of Jehovah's Witnesses over the past century. By creating a two-tier system of salvation, with a small heavenly class and a large earthly class, the organization has fostered a sense of spiritual hierarchy that affects how witnesses view themselves, their relationship with God, and their place in the religious community. The effects of this hierarchical system penetrate deep into the psyche of believers and shape the entire culture of the organization. For the vast majority of witnesses, who belong to the great crowd with an earthly hope, there is an implicit message that they are second-class citizens in God's kingdom. While the organization insists that both hopes are equally valid and that the earthly hope is actually the original purpose God had for humanity, the reality is that the heavenly calling is consistently portrayed as superior. The anointed are described as having been specially chosen by God, as having a unique relationship with Christ, as being part of God's government, as understanding spiritual truths more deeply, and as having been granted an extraordinary privilege. The great crowd, by contrast, is described in terms of what they are not. They are not anointed, not going to heaven, not part of the bride of Christ, not ruling with Jesus, not priests in the temple. Their role is to support and follow the anointed leadership. This creates a subtle but pervasive inferiority complex among the earthly class. They can never aspire to the highest spiritual privileges, never claim to have been personally chosen by God in the same way as the anointed, never speak with the same authority on spiritual matters. When an anointed person speaks at a meeting or assembly, their words carry extra weight simply because of their supposed heavenly calling. When the governing body makes decisions, they do so with the implicit understanding that they have divine insight that no member of the great crowd possesses. This dynamic discourages ordinary witnesses from questioning organizational teachings or policies, because who are they, mere earthly subjects, to question those whom God has selected to rule with Christ in heaven? For those who do claim to be anointed, The psychological pressure comes from a different direction. They must constantly validate their calling, both to themselves and to others. If they are younger, they face skepticism and suspicion, with elders and fellow witnesses questioning whether they are truly anointed or are merely confused, emotionally troubled, or seeking attention and status. They must demonstrate exceptional spiritual maturity, knowledge, and devotion to justify their claim. Any moral failing, any doubt, any question about organizational teachings can be interpreted as evidence that they were never truly anointed to begin with. This creates enormous pressure to conform, to appear absolutely certain of their calling, and to never admit to the same struggles, doubts, and questions that all believers face. The doctrine also creates an artificial barrier between witnesses and God. If the anointed are Christ's brothers, as the organization teaches based on Matthew 25 verse 40, and if the great crowd are Christ's friends but not his brothers, then the relationship between God and the average witness is mediated through the anointed class. The great crowd does not have the same intimate relationship with Jesus that the anointed do. They do not participate in the new covenant, which the organization teaches is exclusively between Jehovah and the 144,000. Their prayers are offered to Jehovah through Jesus, but they are not part of Jesus' spiritual family in the same way. This theological construction places a layer of separation between the believer and God, making the anointed class, particularly the governing body, essential intermediaries in the relationship between God and humanity. This is precisely the kind of priestly mediation that Protestant reformers rejected, yet here it reappears in a different form within the Watchtower organization. The impact on children raised in the organization is particularly profound. From an early age, they are taught that they almost certainly belong to the great crowd and will live forever on earth. The heavenly calling is presented as something rare, special, and not for them. This shapes their spiritual identity and their aspirations. They do not pray for God to reveal their calling or destiny. They accept without question that they are part of the earthly class. This predetermined classification can limit their spiritual development and their sense of personal connection with God. They are taught to be followers, not leaders, to be subjects, not rulers, to be servants of the anointed rather than equals before God. For those who eventually leave the organization, the psychological damage of the two-tier system often remains. Many ex-witnesses describe feelings of never being good enough, of always being on the outside looking in, of spiritual inferiority that took years to overcome. Some report that even after leaving, they struggled with the idea that they might not be worthy of heaven, that God had predetermined they were only fit for earthly life. The doctrine had so deeply shaped their self-perception that even rejecting the organization did not immediately free them from its psychological effects. This is the true cost of the 144,000 doctrine, not merely theological confusion, but deep-seated spiritual insecurity and a distorted understanding of humanity's relationship with God. As we reach the second quarter of the 21st century, the Watchtower Society's doctrine of the 144,000 stands as a testament to the impossibility of maintaining a false teaching indefinitely. Despite numerous revisions, adjustments, and explanations, the fundamental contradictions remain unresolved, and the official numbers continue to contradict the theology. Each passing year brings more evidence that something is profoundly wrong with this doctrine, yet the organization continues to defend it, unwilling to admit that their interpretation might be fundamentally flawed. The collapse of the narrative is happening in slow motion, visible to anyone willing to look honestly at the facts. The memorial reports tell an undeniable story. In 2021, the number of partakers reached 21,434. In 2022, it was 21,182. In 2023, it climbed to 22,312. These are not the numbers of a closed group dwindling toward extinction. These are the numbers of a group that is either growing or, at minimum, remaining stable despite more than 80 years having passed since the calling supposedly closed in 1935. Even after the organization officially abandoned the 1935 date in 2007, one would expect that natural death would steadily reduce the number of anointed ones. After all, if the anointed were selected throughout Christian history, with the majority chosen in the first century and throughout the subsequent centuries, then those remaining on earth should be elderly and decreasing rapidly. Yet the numbers contradict this expectation year after year. The organization's response has been to cast doubt on the legitimacy of many of these partakers. They have suggested that mental illness, pride, presumption, or even demonic influence might be causing people to partake unworthily. But this response creates more problems than it solves. If the organization cannot distinguish between true and false anointed ones, if they must publicly question the validity of thousands of their own members' supposed divine calling, then what does this say about the clarity of God's communication with His people? How can an organization claim to be the sole channel of truth while simultaneously admitting that thousands of its members are fundamentally confused about the most important aspect of their spiritual identity? Moreover, the continued increase in partakers raises a troubling question about the original interpretation. If God is still calling people to the anointed class in significant numbers in the 21st century, if the selection process is ongoing and perhaps far from complete, then the urgency that has always characterized the witness message dissipates. For over a century, Jehovah's Witnesses have been told that they are living in the last days, that the end is imminent, that Armageddon could come at any moment. The completion of the 144,000 was supposed to be one of the final markers before the end arrived. But if that completion is still decades away, if God is actively calling thousands more to fill remaining positions, then the timeline extends indefinitely into the future. This undermines the entire eschatological framework that the organization has built. The doctrine has also become a source of confusion and embarrassment for witnesses trying to explain their beliefs to others. When someone asks a witness to explain who the 144,000 are and why the number is increasing rather than decreasing, the explanations quickly become convoluted. The witness must explain that the number is literal but the tribes are symbolic, that the selection closed in 1935 but didn't really close, that there are replacements for unfaithful anointed ones but we don't know how many, that many who claim to be anointed might not be but we can't identify which ones are mistaken, and that the end is near even though the selection process is ongoing. These explanations satisfy few people, and many witnesses simply avoid the topic altogether because they themselves do not fully understand the current teaching or how to defend it coherently. Within the organization, there are growing whispers of doubt about the 144,000 doctrine, particularly among younger witnesses who have access to information outside official channels. Internet forums, YouTube channels, and podcasts by former witnesses and current doubters have extensively analyzed the contradictions in this teaching. These voices point out that the organization has painted itself into a corner, trapped by a literal interpretation that made sense in the 19th century but has become increasingly untenable as time has passed and the numbers have refused to cooperate. Some suggest that the organization will eventually be forced to abandon the literal interpretation entirely and admit that 144,000 is symbolic. But such an admission would require acknowledging that a foundational doctrine had been wrong for over a century, something the governing body seems unwilling to do. The most damning evidence of the doctrine's failure is not statistical but logical. If God knows exactly how many people He wants in heaven, if He has predetermined that this number is 144,000, and if He began selecting these individuals 2,000 years ago, then He would have a plan to complete this selection in a reasonable time frame. The fact that in 2023, more than 2 millennia after Christ's death and nearly 90 years after the selection supposedly closed, God is apparently still calling people to fill these positions suggests either that God is a poor planner who did not anticipate how long it would take to fill 144,000 slots, or that the human interpretation of His plan is fundamentally flawed. The latter option is far more likely, but it is an option the Watchtower Society cannot officially embrace without undermining their claim to be God's sole channel of accurate biblical interpretation. After examining the history, the contradictions, the revisions, and the psychological impact of the 144,000 doctrine, we are left with a fundamental question that every Jehovah's Witness must ultimately confront. How many times can a teaching change before it stops being truth and starts being recognized as human error? The Watchtower Society has long claimed that their understanding of Scripture becomes progressively clearer over time, that God gradually reveals truth to His organization, and that adjustments in doctrine are evidence of humility and responsiveness to divine guidance rather than proof of previous error. They cite Proverbs 4 verse 18, which speaks of the path of the righteous becoming brighter and brighter until full daylight, as justification for their changing doctrines. But there is a crucial difference between progressive clarification and fundamental contradiction. Progressive clarification means that core truths remain stable while details and applications become clearer over time. Fundamental contradiction means that today's teaching directly contradicts yesterday's teaching, requiring believers to accept that what was once taught as absolute truth was actually false, and to trust that the current teaching is absolute truth even though it may be revised again in the future. The history of the 144,000 doctrine falls into the latter category. It is not a story of gradual clarification but of repeated reversals, forced by the failure of the doctrine to align with reality. Consider the arc of this teaching. Russell taught that the 144,000 and the great multitude were both heavenly classes and that the selection would be complete by 1914. Rutherford taught that only the 144,000 were heavenly, The great multitude was earthly, and the selection closed in 1935. Subsequent leaders taught that the 1935 date was definite and that the anointed would decrease to 0 before Armageddon. Current leaders have abandoned the 1935 date, admitted they cannot determine who is truly anointed, acknowledged that the number is increasing rather than decreasing, and suggested that the calling might continue indefinitely. At each stage, witnesses were told they had the truth. At each stage, those who questioned were labeled as apostates or weak in faith. At each stage, the organization demanded absolute loyalty and trust. Yet each stage contradicted the previous one, sometimes dramatically. The question for Jehovah's Witnesses is not whether they should trust in God or His Word, but whether they should trust an organization that has been consistently wrong about this fundamental doctrine for over a century. If the Watchtower Society was wrong about the 144,000 being completed by 1914, wrong about the 1935 date, wrong about the decrease in anointed ones, and wrong about being able to identify true from false anointed ones, why should anyone believe they are right about the doctrine now? And if they are wrong about the 144,000, what does that say about their other teachings, particularly those that have also changed over time, such as the understanding of this generation, the nature of Christ's presence, the identity of the faithful and discreet slave, and countless other doctrines that have been revised or reversed? The answer that many witnesses give is that imperfect men make mistakes, but the organization is still God's channel. They point to the organization's moral teachings, their evangelistic zeal, and their unity as evidence of divine blessing. But this answer sidesteps the real issue. The problem is not that the organization made an honest mistake that they quickly corrected. The problem is that they taught error as absolute truth for decades, disfellowshipped people who questioned that error, demanded complete submission to that error, and then quietly revised the error while insisting that they had always been teaching truth. This pattern is not evidence of divine guidance gradually clarifying truth. It is evidence of human leadership protecting their authority at all costs. The mystery of the 144,000, when fully examined, reveals itself to be a mirror reflecting the nature of the Watchtower organization. It shows an institution that prioritizes maintaining power over admitting error, that values control over truth, and that manipulates Scripture to serve organizational needs rather than humbly submitting organizational needs to Scripture. The doctrine was created to establish hierarchy, revised to maintain relevance, adjusted to explain contradictions, and defended despite overwhelming evidence of its failure. It has caused spiritual harm to millions, creating unnecessary divisions between believers, fostering spiritual inferiority, and placing human authority between individuals and their God. For those who have the courage to look honestly at this doctrine and its history, the conclusion is inescapable. The Watchtower Society's interpretation of the 144,000 is not divinely inspired truth gradually being clarified, but human error repeatedly being revised to accommodate reality. The true mystery is not who the 144,000 are, but how an organization could maintain such an obviously flawed teaching for so long and why millions of sincere believers continue to accept it without question. Perhaps the deepest mystery of all is that when confronted with clear evidence that a doctrine is false, many people choose to defend the doctrine rather than question the organization that taught it. This is the power of religious authority, and this is the danger of placing that authority above truth. The question that remains for every Jehovah's Witness who encounters this information is simple but profound. Will you continue to trust an organization that has been provably wrong about fundamental doctrines for over a century, or will you have the courage to acknowledge that truth does not change, only human error does? Will you continue to accept revisions, adjustments, and new light as evidence of divine guidance, or will you recognize a pattern of human manipulation and organizational self-preservation? Will you remain loyal to an institution that demands your absolute trust while repeatedly failing to justify that trust, or will you reclaim your own relationship with God, free from the mediating authority of men who claim divine insight but demonstrate human fallibility? The mystery of the 144,000 is solved not by accepting increasingly complex explanations from the Watchtower Society, but by recognizing that the number is symbolic, the interpretation is flawed, and the organization is not what it claims to be. Once you see this truth, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the pattern of manipulation and control, you cannot unknow it. And once you realize that truth does not need constant revision to remain true, you cannot return to accepting obvious error as divine revelation. This is the real mystery. Not who the 144,000 are, but how many more years will pass before the Watchtower Society admits what has been evident for decades, that they were wrong, that they are wrong, and that their claim to be God's sole channel of truth has always been built on a foundation of interpretive error and organizational self-interest. Truth never fears being questioned. Only lies require constant updating. And the tale of the 144,000 is not a story of truth becoming clearer over time. It is a story of error being perpetually revised to avoid admitting that error was ever made. That is the mystery. That is the manipulation. And that is what every honest seeker of truth must ultimately confront.